the process of information gathering, right? The process of making evaluation, right? That process is the single most important process in democracy. We're able to cultivate discernment. We're able to evaluate, right? We're able to place value. We're able to weigh competing narratives. We're able not to get lost in a kind of, woke culture. We need a balanced story, but actually to stand for truth and not to always be giving up our values, right? And distorting the truth for the intent of some intended gain we have for whatever our own contribution is. But we actually stand for truth. We actually stand in the integrity, right, of sense making, right, of information gathering, of evaluating information. But this week we're going to start in a surprising way, because seduction always requires surprise. And this is week 2. Last week we talked about sacred seduction and unholy seduction. We made a lot of distinctions. This week was our second week on seduction, and we're going to talk about the intellectual seduction, or the collective arousal, the collective intellectual arousal, or the arousal to our own capacity to discern, right? The central arousal to sense making that requires us to step out of, right, the monological internet and step into a kind of deep dialogical, right, conversation with ourselves and with reality to actually be able to cultivate, right, our new public culture, right, our new commons. And that's the only way we get over the tragedy of the commons, is to actually create a new possibility, right, of dialogos, a new possibility of discernment, right, a new possibility of sense making. So David, this is a big week. This is a big week, everybody. David, take us inside. Here we go.
This week's evolutionary love code. There's no love without seduction. Seduction is a first principle and first value of cosmos. Wisdom is to distinguish between holy seduction and unholy seduction. Holy seduction seduces upwards. Unholy seduction seduces downwards. Unholy seduction is, I seduce you to violate your appropriate boundary for the sake of my greed. Whereas holy seduction is, I seduce you to transcend the boundary of your limitation, of your contraction, for the sake of your and reality's deepest need. Everyone is seduced. The question is to trust the right person to seduce you, or the right people, or art, or music, or dharma. I'll resonate it one more time. There's no love without seduction. Seduction is a first principle and first value of cosmos. And wisdom is to distinguish between holy seduction and unholy seduction. Holy seduction seduces upwards. Unholy seduction seduces downwards. Unholy seduction is, I seduce you to violate your appropriate boundary for the sake of my greed. Whereas holy seduction is, I seduce you to transcend the boundary of your limitation, of your contraction, for the sake of your and reality's deepest need. Everyone is seduced. The question is to trust the right person to seduce you, or the right people, or art, or music, or dharma. With that, I turn my word back to you, beloved Dr. Mark.
Thank you. Right, David. Gorgeous, right? Gorgeous, David. Welcome to One Mountain. Right? Welcome to the heart of the revolution. Welcome to this place, this time between worlds, this time between stories, in which we're here to articulate the new story of value based on first principles and first values, and to seduce ourselves, to arouse ourselves, right, to this new story, which means we've got to step out of, David, this is for you, the torporitic slumber of the pseudo-ecstasies of the digital, right? That's it. That's the sentence, right? Can we arouse ourselves out of the torporitic slumber of the pseudo-ecstasies of the digital? Okay, let's step in. So we're going to do something, unusual. We're going to look today at public culture. And what do we need to kind of arouse ourselves in public culture to seduce ourselves to sense making? Now, I'm going to ask Krista to put in the chat box the note that we send out a couple of days ago and just welcome everyone. It's so good to be together. Let's put in the chat box the note that we sent out a couple of days ago. And I want to read the first part of it. And that's going to kind of set our tone. Then we're going to go to the movies. We're going to see, one movie clip. Then we're going to chat. We're going to see another movie clip. And we're going to try and establish some principles as a model of self-seduction intellectually. The seduction of discernment. Seduce thyself. This is a note we sent to set up our conversation for this week. Taking responsibility for your own arousal. The old Delphic oracle in ancient Greece said, know thyself. And know, right, in the sacred texts, right, know always means carnal knowledge, right? And Adam knew his wife Eve, right? Know thyself, and Adam knew his wife Eve, okay? Let's go to the next step. To know is to know the depth of Eros. To know thyself means know how to make love with yourself. To make love with yourself means to birth into reality the most stunning, gorgeous, wildly unique, and beautiful version of you. Right? It is that version of you that reality desperately yearns for, and that's what we call your unique self. Okay? Now, to be that, right, to seduce yourself into your unique self, right, you require, right, this ability to seduce yourself. And to seduce yourself means you have to have the capacity of doing sense making. And precisely the society we're creating today is a society of upgraded algorithms and downgraded human beings. Human beings who are not aroused. Human beings who have lost their access to authentic free will. Human beings who are manipulated, right, by web algorithms coming at them so fast and moving so carefully, and that are so carefully programmed. Because what we now have are personalized, micro-targeted campaigns, right, to hijack your attention and to form your opinion in internet silos and echo chambers, which are virtually impossible unless you seduce yourself, unless you arouse yourself, unless you step in and cultivate your unique self-discernment. You actually lose access to your own Eros. So then what we said this week was, right, in the mailing we sent, we said, what are you willing to die for? That's the instruction for who do you want to be, right? What are you willing to die for? Say it softer, whisper it with quivering tenderness. What are you willing to die for? And if there's nothing you're willing to die for, you're already dead. And then when you know when you're aroused to realization, when you're aroused to the realization of what you're willing to die for, then live for it. And this is the core of this week, right? So what am I willing to die for? And if I'm not willing to die for anything, I'm already dead. But once I'm aroused to the realization of what I'm willing to die for, then I begin to live for it. Now, what does that mean? What am I willing to die for? So, and friends, beloveds, sometimes we're willing to die for a mother, a father, a partner, a son, a daughter, even a friend. And that's beautiful. But it never occurs to us that we need to die for ourselves. We need to die to birth ourselves. And it also never occurs to us that we're willing to die for a value, right? And that if we're not willing to die for a value, if we're not willing to die for a set of values, then we're already dead. And we think that the people who are willing to die for values are kamikaze Japanese pilots or Islamic fundamentalists, right, who are suicide bombers, or Christian crusaders, right, who attack a Muslim fortress, right, dying for the glory of God. Right? We identify, right, the willingness to die for something, right, as the mark of regressive fundamentalism, insanity, right, psychosis, right? When we hear what are you willing to die for, it actually makes us frightened. But actually, there are obviously regressive, fundamentalist, even psychotic versions of being willing to die for something. That's self-evidently true. But there's also not pre-personal, but transpersonal, noble, wondrous willingness to die for something. Like the Avengers movie, Marvel, 2019, 2020, Tony Stark finally gets to a place where he's willing to die for something and saves the galaxy. That's what it means to become a hero. And if I have a broader vision of death, if I understand that life's not over when it's over, if I have an understanding that I'm part of a larger field of consciousness, if I understand that there's a continuity of consciousness, which is the implicit knowing of the hero at the moment in which they sacrifice themselves, right? Then I wake up to myself. Then I realize, oh, there's something I'm willing to die for. There's values I'm willing to die for. If there's no values I'm willing to die for, then I'm basically in a race for immortality in this body and in this lifetime, which I will inevitably lose. I will inevitably lose, and my life is pathetic. My life is a crumbling, pathetic failure because I'm in a race for egoic immortality in this body, and it's a race that I will be defeated in a horrific way. That's a given. So if that's my goal, then I've already failed. So my goal is actually to live the fullest, most gorgeous, most stunning life, and to live for those values that I'm willing to die for. Does everyone get that? My goal is to live for those values that I'm willing to die for. Wow. Okay? So we're gonna start to put this together. I know there's a bunch of strands on the table, and we're gonna start to really put this together in a deep way here. Okay? So let's see if we can get this. So let's take a look at a clip. I want to show you a clip. It's a very, very intense clip. It comes from Tom Hanks. I'm going to ask you to just kind of be gentle in it. It runs about not more than 2 minutes. It's about a 2-minute clip, right? And it's about men, in this case, being willing to die for something. So let's just go slow. This is part of our study. It's part of our meditation. Let's see if we can see this, feel into it, and then talk about it. And all of this is going to be part of our own self-seduction, our own arousal, right, to our fullest humanity, right, to the possibility of being new humans, to the sensuality of sense-making. That's what we're looking for here. So Krista, take us inside. So that was a short clip, and it didn't actually show the full scene that I wanted to see, right? But if you actually follow, right, a longer version of that clip in the beginning of this movie, right, what you'll actually see is that pretty much all of those men were killed, right? In other words, you see men being mowed down, right, on the beaches of Normandy. Now, they knew going in they were going to be mowed down. And they knew that at least half of them wouldn't walk out of that beach alive. So why were they there? What were they willing to die for? It wasn't win-lose metrics. It was freedom. Okay, I want to get that, okay? Right? It wasn't just they were drafted. No, actually they were standing for something. Right? The same way that Ukraine now, right, with all of the complexity, glory to Ukraine and glory to the heroes, they were actually standing for something. They were standing for the American way. They were standing for, right? They were innocent, right? Tragic beyond imagination, and their willingness to die on the beaches of Normandy turned the tide of World War II and defeated Nazism, right? And created, in many ways, the world we live in. Now, what were they willing to die for? They weren't willing to die for McDonald's. It wasn't for McDonald's. Right? They weren't willing to die for apple pie. Right? They weren't willing to die for baseball. But there was an overarching cause. Today in the Ukraine, what is Ukraine fighting for? Right? Ukraine's fighting for freedom. And is Ukraine unbelievably complex? Yes, it is. And have we talked for 4 weeks about doing deep sense making on Ukraine? Yes, we have. But in the end, there's a second simplicity, right? They're dying for something. They're dying for the values of democracy. They're dying for, right, the values, right, of freedom. Right? They're valuing, and what are the values of democracy and freedom? And I want to get this because this is so insanely important. You know, there's an entire set of studies, and stay close, friends, okay? There's an entire set of studies, okay? Right? And this is unbelievably important. This is not about, did they have a full cogent sense of this? Right? That's not the issue. The issue is, what was this about? Right? My sons, right, are both soldiers at 18, right? And they have a deep sense of what being soldiers meant, right, at 18, right? There was a deep sense, right, in American culture that we needed to oppose Nazism. Nazism means opposing the gas chambers. It means opposing the Holocaust. It means opposing, right, the worst tyrannies in the world. And we've got to be really understanding. We've got to be careful of this postmodern cynicism, right? We're actually afraid to stand for value, which is what Putin assumed has so infested the West that actually no one would stand with Ukraine. And Ukraine has actually reminded the West that there's something about standing for freedom. That's a very big deal. And if there's nothing I'm willing to die for, I'm already dead. You know, I've shared with you a couple of times when I was with the Dalai Lama in his, you know, room in Dharamsala, we talked about the need for an army, right? Right? The need for an army, right, of people that are willing to die for a higher value. Now, I fully know in my body that when we die to, right, into a higher order of consciousness. We move from this dimension to another dimension. Nonetheless, right, the experience of dying is real, right? And whatever the next dimension is, right, there's an experience of death, which requires great heroism. And the hero is willing to die for a higher value, and we're able to discern between a false cause and a true cause. When we talk in cosmorotic humanism, we talk about 6 levels of pleasure. All right, the third level of pleasure is the pleasure of standing for a cause. But every pleasure has a counterfeit version. So the counterfeit version of that pleasure is a pseudo cause, right? A pseudo value. So there's no question that there's a great danger in hijacking the human nobility to be willing to stand for a cause. We can hijack that for a pseudo cause. Absolutely. But having said that, right, the willingness of these kids, right, to storm the beaches of Normandy, right, is huge, right? You know, my dear friend Lori Galperin, right, her dad was on those beaches, right? And she's described her dad to me and to KK in very great depth and detail, right? Her dad was one of those 18-year-olds, right, on those beaches. And he couldn't have articulated exactly, you know, the Jeffersonian principles, or he didn't know the Federalist Papers, but he got in his body that freedom matters and that democracy matters. Now, freedom and democracy, and this is, now let's get to our core point. Freedom and democracy are not apple pie. It's not baseball, right? It's not McDonald's. Freedom and democracy are based on, you know, 2 principles. I'm going to focus on one of them. And what I'm going to focus on is how we gather information, how we do judgment, right? The structure of justice in society. Right? What's the structure of justice that operates in society and that moves society? How do we evaluate a person? How do we form judgments, right, in public culture? Right? How do we form judgments in courts? But particularly now I want to talk about public culture, because public culture is actually where most judgment's happening today, not in courts. Right? How do we, the process of information gathering, right? The process of making evaluation, right? That process is the single most important process in democracy. We're able to cultivate discernment. We're able to evaluate, right? We're able to place value. We're able to weigh competing narratives. We're able not to get lost in a kind of, you know, woke culture, we need a balanced story, but actually to stand for truth and not to always be giving up our values, right, and distorting the truth for the intent of some intended gain we have for whatever our own contribution is, but we actually stand for truth. We actually stand in the integrity, right, of sense making, right, of information gathering, of evaluating information. And when we don't do that, when we get lost in the pseudo ecstasies, right, of the crowd, right? What was his name? Charles, I think, Hacker. I've got to look it up. I jotted it down here. Right now, I think it was Charles Mackey. I think it was like in the 1840s, a Scottish journalist, right, who made up, right, a phrase. He called it the madness of crowds, right? The madness of crowds. And the madness of crowds is, sometimes you'll go into a particular internet site. It might even be an internet site that claims to have a high level of consciousness, but there's a madness of crowds there, right? There's not an actual sense of evidence and conversation and discernment, right? There's actually a kind of politically correct woke echo chamber where people reflect each other, and actually the voices that are least enlightened and least clear and least loving and least compassionate actually rise to the top. And that's actually how the entire internet works today. The entire internet is actually geared towards the lowest common denominator, and information gathering is actually taking place, right, primarily on the internet today. That's a shocking piece of information. And the internet is driven, as Douglas Murray correctly pointed out, by the madness of crowds. Wow. Because I want to get that. And we're often willing on the internet, right, to engage, right, in some version of sacrifice, right? We sacrifice people, right? And it's very deep. It's very deep. I want to just give you an example, right? In the Salem witch trials, right? What were the Salem witch trials about? The Salem witch trials were about accusing a woman of being a witch. And why was the woman accused of being a witch? And hundreds of thousands of women, some think millions, were killed. Many of them burnt at the stake, because we were actually living in an era in Europe and then in Salem in America, but primarily in Europe, in which the madness of crowds reigned. So if you had a woman who was her femininity, her feminine threatened society, she was a healer, right? Her sexuality may have been different than the classical structures of sexuality, right? She didn't fit into church doctrine, right? The easiest thing to do was to accuse her of being a witch. And that's what we did. Right? And then what would happen is, I just want you to know what would happen is, then you would, within a period of a couple of weeks, you would have a dozen first-person testimonies as to her witchcraft. Right? There's never one complaint, there's always a dozen, right? Because there's a kind of infection, a kind of contagion, right, in the madness of crowds. So now we've got a dozen, 2 dozen first-person testimonies attesting to her witchcraft. And of course, right, as scholarship has pointed out, there were often an entire set of hidden ulterior motives behind, right, the accusations of witchcraft, which were all sorts of political machinations, all sorts of rivalrous conflict, win-lose metrics, right, tragic games of the worst kind of games that people play, and hundreds of thousands and millions of women paid the price. So there wasn't an ability, right, to actually gather information. Now today, we don't live in a religious zeitgeist on the internet. We live in a psychological zeitgeist. So we don't call a person a witch, we call them a narcissist, or we call them a sociopath, right? But that's the same thing as calling a person a witch. And then we don't use the formal Salem witch trials, but we create Twitter threads, right, in which people are very, very afraid of being called out, because if you're called out in the wrong way in a Twitter thread, and then it comes up, right, on the Google search about you when someone accused you of something, that remains on the internet forever. So we live in the pseudo eros of Twitter threads, which are not about discernment, right, not about weighing information, right, not about face-to-face feeling each other, right, not about actually even reading or checking information in a serious way, because who's reading, but it's based on an evocative, emotive madness of crowds with kind of an automatic clickbaiting, right, low-level, tragic, lowest common denominator human play, right? That's actually how judgments are formed today. Right? It's a kind of an unbelievable structure. And we don't know, we haven't created litmus tests to actually discern, right? How can we tell the difference between what's going on? How can we actually discern between what is kind of internet abuse, the madness of crowds, right, an abandonment of principle? What's a kind of modern version of Salem witch trials, right? And what actually is important issues that need to be looked at, need to be weighed. Now, this is not a minor thing. This is what those boys were dying for. And yes, they couldn't quite articulate it. They couldn't. They were 18 from Kansas and New York and Montana and San Francisco. But they knew it. And culture knew it. Culture knew that actually the way Putin is doing sense making today is to remove all possibilities of people doing independent and serious sense making. But at the same time, right, in the United States, right, our own kind of American group of oligarchs, right, are controlling the internet and controlling the information flow, right, and creating micro-targeted, personalized advertising, forming opinions, right, that are actually undermining our core central ability to do sense making and to arouse ourselves, right, into, right, our unique capacity to discern. That's a big deal. So this is not nothing, right? What those boys were dying for on the beaches of Normandy was, right, I'm gonna use an unpopular word, the American way. Now, America's filled with flaws. And I read the book when I was a kid, The Ugly American, which kind of critiques America's world policy. And there's a lot to critique in America. And America's a great country, right? It's actually the single most successful, right, multiracial country in the history of planet Earth. And as Barack Obama correctly says, right, it's a dream in the making. Right? It's a dream that's unfulfilled, right? But we can't forget the dream. What happens to a dream deferred, wrote Langston Hughes? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? And the dream of America, that you can actually feel safe and held in the arms of Lady Justice. And Lady Justice is the divine feminine, right? That's the divine feminine. That's Lady Justice, right? I don't know if anyone's ever been kind of on a vacation in the wrong part of Mexico, right, where your goods are stolen, and you go to the local police and you realize, oh, they're probably involved with the people who stole them. That happens in Mexico tragically all over the place, right? There's not a sense of being held in the arms of justice, one of the tragedies of corruption and in many parts of the third world. And it's obviously not true all over Mexico, but it's a demarcating characteristic, right, of many, many, many towns. Christina just came back from Mexico a couple of days ago and we were just talking about it, right? We take it as an assumption that we're actually held in the United States or in a Western democracy in the arms of justice. And that justice is imperfect. And that justice is often available only to people with dispensable income. And that justice is often not available, right, to lower socioeconomic classes, in which I include myself, right? So that justice, it's a dream in the making. But at least the aspiration is clear. It's that we do justice. We look at every individual case. We're not involved in a kind of identity politics in which we dismiss men, right, or Jews, right, or blacks. We look at every individual case. We evaluate individually information. People are innocent until proven guilty. That's a big deal. So I'll just give you an example of it. And this is what those boys were dying for on the beaches of Normandy. I'm going to give you just one simple example. This has happened. I was going to write an essay on this. I didn't have time. But I've tracked this over the last 5 years. There's a new word in the press, and the word is credibly accused. And this has kind of found its way. It's one of the woke downloads into culture. We used to say a person's innocent until proven guilty. Now a person's credibly accused. And credibly accused is a very, very subjective term invented by journalists that's deployed, unevenly, and often, right, credibly accused also has an enormous amount to how the public responds to the accusation, right? It's a big deal, right? The assumption, right? A whole set of assumptions, right, that need to be challenged, right, exist in this word credibly accused. And the second a person is termed credibly accused, that's it. They're credibly accused. There's been no process. There's been no evaluation of information. There's been no fact checking, right? But the person is credibly accused. So that's it. End of conversation. That's the destruction of the American dream. The second that we actually are lost in, and I'm going to say it again, the pseudo ecstasies of internet hysteria, the Roman Colosseum reenacted on the internet, right? Exactly what we stood against for in Lady Justice was the pseudo-ecstasies of sacrificing innocent victims. And when we sacrifice innocent victims, we literally rip their hearts out and we throw them into the flames. And all the while, we pray that it's not us. So imagine it happened to your daughter. Imagine it happened to your mother. Imagine it happened to your beloved, right? And this is the culture we're living in. So it's, am I willing to die for justice? Right? And if I'm willing to die for justice, don't die for it, but live for it. Let me show you a clip. I want to do one more clip. This is a clip of, our good friend who played the role of Indiana Jones. And it's a clip of the pseudo-ecstasies of the pre-modern, in which there's no justice, in which the heart is ripped out and the crowds go wild, right? And the human being is sacrificed. Let's take a look for a second, just to see what that looks like.
अब इसकी जान मेरी मुट्ठी में है अब इसकी जान मेरी मुट्ठी में है
I want to catch that. That is a Twitter thread. You just watched a Twitter thread. Does everyone get what I mean by that? You just watched a Twitter thread. Right? In other words, you rip someone's heart out. That person is demonized. That person is dehumanized. Does everyone get that? That person is dehumanized. Their heart's ripped out. Do you see the crowd going wild? The kind of ecstasy of the crowd? The ecstasy of the crowd is being manipulated by the high priest. Does everyone get this? But the high priest in this case is not one high priest. It's an algorithm. Right? It's an algorithm that's geared to generate profit and power to about 5 or 6 companies run by about 15 people. Okay? Right? And people are regularly, lives are ruined. Right? Families are destroyed regularly. Right? In Twitter threads, right? In Facebook threads, right? In ostensibly sacred places and lots of not sacred places, because the actual discernment, right? People are caught up in the pseudo ecstasy of the crowd. And the madness of crowd is subtle. And people are caught in the excitement of the crowd. Okay? Right? Like, wow. Does everyone get that? And how many people get it? It's kind of shocking to see. Right? This is exactly what democracy stands against. Democracy stands against the notion that we do judgments, right, based on, right, processes that are about arousing feeling, and we arouse the feeling by hijacking a legitimate issue and then whipping up the crowd, right, in fear of that issue. Let's give you an example. Take McCarthyism. McCarthyism was against communism. Communism was a hugely important issue to be against, right? Does everyone agree to that? Communism had killed tens of millions of people in the world. Communism, under various forms, had been the single most brutal, repressive force in human history. So it was built in noble goals. Most of the Jewish intellectuals in New York were communists in the 1930s. And they were affiliated with the Communist Party because the rhetoric of communism was beautiful and seemed at least similar in part to the rhetoric of the prophets. But the actions of communism, right, in the Ukraine, for example, right, killing 5 million people in forced starvation, right, in order to comply with a particular government policy, and that kind of brutal Stalin-esque horror was repeated again and again. Okay? Now just stay close for a second. So McCarthy, who's the senator from the United States, takes a legitimate issue called communism, and then he uses it to whip up the madness of crowds. This is before the internet, right, using the newspapers, but actually what's actually driving him is all sorts of personal pathology, all sorts of personal agendas, all sorts of power issues. And so the entire McCarthyite attack on many, many, many people in a democratic society takes place because everyone steps back and no one's willing to stand up for it. And why is no one willing to stand up? Because everyone says, well, but I've got to make my contribution. So I'm not going to actually stand up to this horror. Right? No, so everyone steps back, right, making sure to protect themselves, and no one actually takes a stand. So there's a new term called sexual McCarthyism. And sexual McCarthyism is we use, for example, our correct fury at sexual harassment, or our correct fury at patterns of sexual abuse. But then what happens is we create sexual McCarthyism. In other words, we use, just like we used the fear and anger and outrage against communism, we use the legitimate outrage against, let's say, sexual harassment to whip up the madness of crowds and to actually become McCarthyite, meaning to hide all sorts of hidden agendas, to hide all sorts of hidden motivations under the veneer of protecting victims, under the veneer of making sure there's not new, right? And it's whatever the veneer is. So that's called sexual McCarthyism. So McCarthyism means you take a legitimate issue, you hijack that issue, then you use it for the most base of human motives, which are to suspend the process of evaluating information, to suspend the process of evidence, to suspend the process of justice. So all of this is a violation of the goddess. This is the great violation of the goddess. And I'm going to go 2 more steps and we're going to finish. And I just madly appreciate your time. I'm going to get 2 more steps. Okay? So here's step 1. I want to give you, how do we now seduce ourselves? Let's go back to the beginning and arouse ourselves, right, to be able to do discernment. We have to arouse ourselves to sense making. So first, I got to know, what am I willing to die for? That was our first step. Does everyone get that? What am I willing to die for? So what did we see? We saw on the beaches of Normandy, these boys, right? Laurie's dad being one of them, being willing to die for justice, right? And as I didn't see who it was, but I saw someone pointed out, a couple of people in the chat box pointed out correctly, it wasn't quite coherent in their mind. Right? It was more of a visceral knowing, and it was a cultural knowing. I'm not talking about each individual boy from Montana, but these boys were willing to, they're willing to die for justice. That's unbelievable. And we're in their debt, and their willingness to die for justice defeated Nazism and created the world that each one of us on this Zoom today live in. Okay, so that's step 1. Beautiful. Okay. So I got to identify, what am I willing to die for? I'm willing to die for justice. 2, then I don't die for it. I live for it. So now I've got to live for justice. But justice means, right, that's the core of the American way, means how I gather information, how I do evaluation, right? How we actually create fairness, right, and integrity, right, in our public spaces, right? That's number 2. Number 3, right, that means we don't get lost in the pseudo-ecstasies of the Salem witch trials, right? That we actually do careful case-by-case information gathering, and we're careful not to get caught in these contagious memes in which we accuse a woman, right, who is sexually or intellectually, right, or spiritually, right, post-conventional in some way, or who's threatening to the community, right, from being actually burnt at the stake. Or we prevent people with ulterior motives arousing, right, these kind of, that's why we call them witch hunts, right, in order to accomplish their own hidden ulterior motives, because we actually begin to cultivate discernment, right? So cultivating discernment is such a big deal, right? And that was the move from the pre-modern pseudo-ecstasies of the pre-rational, right, into this evolutionary leap into the rational. And here's the thing, right? Around the world, both the far right and the far left that are dominating the discourse are both abandoning actually civil discourse. They're abandoning a baseline of facts, right? They're abandoning how we actually talk to each other and do point counterpoint and actually evaluate information. Right? And they're engaging in, of course, we don't call people witches, we call them sociopaths because we're in a psychological world and not a religious world, but we're actually destroying our public culture. We're destroying the conversation of public culture. We're destroying, right, the public commons, and that's the true tragedy of the commons today. And we need to actually arouse ourselves to create a new public commons, right? A new public ethos, a new public culture. We need to evolve public culture, right, in a real and substantive way. Now, I know we're late. I'm just going to do one last step, okay? Just to complete this for you so we can actually see this and feel this and know this, okay? So how do you discern? So I want to give you an example of discernment. We've talked a lot about it. I want to do just this last second of it. I'm just going to give you one example. I actually took some notes this morning. I wrote like 10 pages. I'm just going to do, one, okay? How do we discern? So how do you know the difference between, something that seems to be a legitimate issue, and in something that actually is disguised as a legitimate issue, but actually there's a whole set of ulterior agendas that are behind it. There's a whole set of motivators. There's a whole set of players, right, which are kind of invisible. It's very hard to know. How do you know that? How can you look at, let's say, we live in a world which is filled with attack, filled with scandal, right? How do you know kind of how these things happen? And I'm going to give you an example which some of you are not going to like, but I apologize for it. But it's a very good example. Mario Cuomo was the governor of New York. Mario Cuomo is a complex politician, okay? And he was, a kind of hard-ass, tough, disliked by an enormous amount of people. Other people thought he was enormously effective, right? But a complicated politician with a long record of service and a long record of controversy. Mario Cuomo, right, during COVID, became really an American hero. I don't know how many people, let me just do a show of hands, and around the world, how many people that, not Mario Cuomo, his son Andrew Cuomo, I apologize. I'm talking about his son Andrew Cuomo. I apologize, not Mario. I apologize, Andrew Cuomo. I apologize. So Andrew, Mario's son, Andrew Cuomo, became a symbol, right, during COVID. He did these incredible press conferences. How many people remember his press conferences? I remember, he was unbelievable, right? They were famous in Holland also, right? They were unbelievable. They were just like wild, and I used to joke around with Christina that, her boyfriend, because Andrew Cuomo was sending out an email every day, really a beautiful email, and he was really holding this place of Eros and this place of love, and Keiko would read as Keiko was in New York, right, during the worst part of COVID, those 4 months, and she'd read his email every day and watch his press conference. Unbelievable, right? In an unbelievable moment. And lots of people wanted him to run for president, and he was talking to his brother Chris Cuomo, right, who was an anchor on CNN, and there was an enormous sense of warmth, kind of, and love, and all of that. A year later, catch this with me for a second, everybody. A year later, Andrew Cuomo was, about a year no longer governor of New York, and there had been a spate of accusations of sexual harassment, right? 9, 10 people. Now, stay close with me. If you look at those accusations, and you look at them clearly, right, they were, to major an understatement, not substantive, right? Most of them have been thrown out already, but the nature of the accusations were, and he had very clear and cogent responses to them, but where did they come from? And did they just appear? He'd been a politician for several decades, right? And he was known to hug people and to kiss people at weddings and et cetera, right? But everyone knew who Cuomo was. Everyone knew his kind of classical, old school style, right? Most people thought he had great integrity. He clearly wasn't known as a womanizer, but he was known, right, to have kind of a certain kind of interaction, which was not kind of politically correct in the modern world, but which should in no way be termed sexual harassment. All of a sudden, he becomes this major hero in the United States, right? Madly loved. He incarnates Eros, and then a process kicks in, which is called the murder of Eros, right? He has to be taken down. And those 10, 12, 13 complaints did not appear out of nowhere, right? They were organized, right? There was a campaign that was, people were in tandem with each other, people checked with each other, people talked to each other, right? It was a carefully, right, organized spontaneity that went to take Andrew Cuomo down. Now, I am not Andrew Cuomo's press spokesperson. I have not investigated each of these cases, although I read as much information I could on every one of them. And we lost, in the United States, one of the best Democratic politicians who could have effectively articulated Democratic politics and who could have challenged the kind of Trump MAGA move that's happening in the United States. But he got destroyed. He got destroyed on what most commentators at this point feel were either trumped up or close to absurd claims. Now, was there one person? There were a dozen, because there's always a dozen, because people are in touch with each other, because you find the disgruntled people, because you find the angry people, because you find the disaffected people. Right? The person who wrote the report about Cuomo, the Attorney General of the state of New York, was announced her intention to run for governor against him, right? And yet she's writing the report about him. It's kind of a strange situation. And the assumption of people was, and I want to stay with me, is that once Cuomo, right, resigned the governorship, everyone said, now he can't come back, right? There's no redemption, right? We can never allow Cuomo to come back again. It's like, wow. So that makes you like, so you got to do discernment. You have to cultivate discernment. What's actually happening here? There was no trial, right? There was no genuine counterpoint that was allowed. There was a process, and the process was evaluated based on public opinion. It was based on Twitter threads. It was based on Facebook threads. It was based on, right, trying to create a certain kind of, right, pseudo-eros explosion of anger in the public sphere. And we lost, right, a very, very important public servant. Now, I'm just giving you one example, but no one points out that this was not spontaneous, that this was organized and careful, right? So to cultivate discernment is we need to kind of say, oh, how's this happening? Where's this coming from, right? Is this a false flag? Not to be conspiratorial, but to actually say, I'm not going to be determined by Twitter threads. And I want to offer you, right, 4 litmus tests that are tried and true that you can know to discern whether what's going on in the public culture is real, right, or whether it's a madness of crowds. Here's the 4 litmus tests. Number 1, when people are attacked in the public sphere, right, you have to ask the question 1, before action was taken, right, was there a fair process, right, of fact-checking, of investigation, of talking to both sides? Meaning before a person was fired, right, Johnny Depp was fired immediately as soon as Amber Heard wrote a column about him, a few years ago. No one checked. There was no interest in checking. Once she wrote the column, the assumption was Johnny Depp's an abuser. Johnny Depp's obviously a complex person, so it played into his complexity, right? And Johnny Depp lost, an enormous amount. Now, I don't think we need to cry for Johnny Depp, blessings to Johnny, but the point was that what happened was it happened before there was any fair checking of information. So that's 1. So if something happens before there's fair checking of information, and before evidence is considered on both sides, that's the first thing you have to look for. Number 2, what if new evidence comes to the fore? So if new evidence comes to the fore, are people willing to consider it? Or if new evidence comes to the fore, people are uninterested. So for example, with Andrew Cuomo, an enormous amount of new information gradually started emerging, right? And his stance became much, much more deeply supported. But once he's gone, no one's willing to look at it again. So there's no willingness to consider new information, number 2. Number 3, is the person who's being attacked being demonized? Is there a demonization happening? Right? Is there a dehumanization happening? Do we begin to talk about the person as if they're not a human being? That we actually can't feel them? So is there demonization and dehumanization, right? Number 3. And number 4 is the assumption in public space that there's never room for resolution. It can never be resolved. That whatever the quote unquote judgment was in the court of the pseudo ecstasies of the digital, right, what we now call public opinion, there's no ability to return. It can never be resolved. Right? There's no redemption. There's no liberation. Right? It's never over. Those are 4 litmus tests. Right? So if judgment and action is taken before there's a fair process of fact-checking, number 1. Number 2, if new evidence is no one's willing to consider it. 3, if there's demonization or dehumanization. And 4, right, if there's never a possibility for it to be healed or solved. So that's an example. That's what I was driving this entire conversation towards that. That's an example, right, of discernment. Those are 4 discernments we can use, right, to actually understand, right, what's going on here. Is this a legitimate public outrage against whatever the issue is, which sometimes has enormous importance in a democracy? Or is this actually something else happening under the veneer, right, of public outrage? And that distinction is enormously important.